Okay, so hello, Guna. It's nice to see you. We're recording this video as part of the teaching exhibition for 2024 at the Gordon Smith Gallery, put on by Artists for Kids. The Gordon Smith Gallery is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. And I'm over here at my house, which is located on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Hunkaminam people and the Hunkaminam and Squamish speaking peoples over in so-called Burnaby. We're starting with this territorial acknowledgement as an act of communal grieving, honestly, that then encourages us to open and strengthen that place in our bodies where we know how much injustice has been systemically woven into the land we live on, and to pay respect to the peoples who have resisted for hundreds of years, knowing that their stories flourished long before colonization and continue to do so now and will forever afterwards. Grief in these seemingly small and oftentimes awkward moments of the territory acknowledgement means reckoning with the injustice, erasure, assimilation that the First Nations people have faced and resisted against some of the systems of governance that we still live in. And it's just wild that we still live in them. So we need this moment to ground our context of land and language, which I'm excited to talk to you about today. I also want to say that we're not just here to critique those systems of oppression that I'm mentioning, but we're here to talk about the relationships that form when we persist against them, to talk about the great strength in telling our stories, and to see how that power can be expressed in the things that we make. And finally, to talk about the moments of imagining a better future that we're capable of evoking through art practices, such as that of yours. So with that, I'm going to pass it to you to introduce yourself.
Satini, Sakat Yuhan, Guna Yuhatu Sak, Dachlawadi Hatsati, Natasa Hinka Tagish, Dach Ayachat, Athlit Guna, Ka Hunka Ishu Duasagan, Ka Peter, Ka Agnes Johns, you Duasagan, Ka Peter, Ka Lily, Ka John, you Duasagan. Ach ishadach yuduasak ka asla yarultin yuduasak yayagi ach tuwu yak hello everyone. Annie.
Yes.
Um I just introduced myself in my traditional Tlingit language, and I told you that my name is Guna. That's my Tlingit name. And it refers to the natural spring water coming down the mountain in the spring. So it's just melting from snow into water. And I told you my traditional territory, that I come from the Carcross Tagish First Nation. And I told you my clan, which is the Ducklawady clan with the killer whale crest. And I told you a few names of my lineage, including my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and the name of my father and the name of my mother. And I told you that I'm doing good today.
Awesome.
So,
I guess I didn't introduce myself either, but I'll just say that my name's Annie and that I'm here because I'm the guest artist curator for this show that I'm so excited that your work is in. So we met each other as students back in like 2018 or 19 or something. And it was in university. And in my memory, we are having a lot of fun, but we are also in this crucible of feeling quite othered by the academic institution we were in. We would show up to each other's events or like talks. I showed up to one of your kits. I felt a little bit like a co-conspirator against our great heist to overthrow the institution.
I remember those times. The days of experiencing and being victim to the racism of the institution, like it's quite burned in my memory. I think it'll live with me forever. And I nowadays, I utilize it as kind of like a fire
Hmm.
to continue to remind me, the work that I aspire to do in the institutions and just in education in general. We became allies, and I think we always have.
I think that us talking about kind of where we met is kind of a nice transition, I guess, into you telling us a little bit about the work that is in the show.
Okay. So this painting is called Self-Portrait, and it's very intentionally called that. I created this work towards the very end of my degree. And so in a lot of the talks that I do and lectures, I utilize this painting as a strategy and as a way to create context and explain, well, and help an audience understand like that this painting, the ideation and it working through me and it coming out on a canvas, like it had so many reasons that it had to exist and it had to come into the world, and it carried 5 years of, suppression, 5 years of grief, 5 years of anger, and 5 years of witnessing. I mean, frankly, like unjust things happen in the institution, and most of all, witnessing racism in in a space that should have been uh in a space and an institution that should have worked in every way possible to make me feel welcomed and make me feel empowered and like make me feel safe. Instead it did everything the opposite. I never felt safe. Um, I never felt welcomed. And well, not never, but you know what I mean. Like by
Yeah.
by the institution and by a lot of instructors in a lot of classes. It became very apparent as I ventured through university that it felt like I had to change who I was fundamentally as a Tlingit woman. And there was numerous racist experiences I had in university where I had instructors um literally try to encourage me to not practice any form line. So the terminology for form line is our word for explaining like the quote unquote shapes that you see in Northwest Coast art. So if you look at the shapes on a quote unquote shapes on a totem pole or a Northwest Coast mask, paddles, anything of the Northwest Coast, that follows a certain system, it's called form line. And so that the practice of form line and learning form line has been and still is a very dominant part of my practice. And falling in love with form line is the reason that I became an artist in the first place. It's the reason I went to school for it. And very quickly into my degree, I was told the same thing in different ways. So my first year, I was told, well, I think you should really get out of your comfort zone. Stuff like that. That it's like maybe this could make sense, but does it make sense? Now I look back and I don't think it does. And I learned during my degree and unfortunately didn't fully understand until the end that most of the time and most of the, I would say like 97% of the time, I was creating artwork and coming from a context and a worldview that none of these instructors and most of these students were never taught in their lifetimes and were never exposed to in their lifetimes. And that is not a coincidence, and it's completely intentional on a national and a colonial level that they don't know.
Mhm.
But rather meeting these points of rather than meeting in the middle with instructors or students, I give more slack to students because I really believe that instructors hold most of the accountability uh in terms of teaching students how to look at artwork and talk about it. I think that's on the instructor. And like the way they handle those situations, they're influencing the students as they're doing it, and they're showing students what's okay and what's not okay. Um, but most of the time people had no idea how to read my work. And I had experiences in school that were led by instructors, where it became a space of a lot of shame.
Hmm.
And I think that theme is extremely important to emphasize in learning spaces, because being in a space of learning that is anchored in shame, which is something that can happen in critique very easily, I think that piece of shame in my mind, I remember thinking that during university, and I stand by it to this day, that piece of shame completely mirrors the element of shame rooted in residential schools and the element of shame inflicted on our people since the beginning of colonialism. And it's really important to emphasize that. So I had experiences of shame, and I continued to feel that shame. And I got to a point where I remember telling myself, like, I don't know how to continue on my journey here in university without changing who I am. And that was about 2.5 years in. And that was shortly after I had that a really intense critique in a printing class where my teacher really publicly humiliated me in front of probably 20 students and totally verbally obliterated the form line that I drew that I wanted to make as a print. And I was really upset, and that was the first time I cried at school. And afterwards, when I calmed down and the class was over, I interrogated him by myself. And I asked him, like, why, essentially, why can't I do this? Why won't you you told us in the beginning of this course that the subject matter can be whatever we want it to be, and you care about technique. So why does that matter now? And he told me, unquote, I just don't think this kind of subject matter is compatible with the materials we're working with. Yeah. And I thought about that. Those words echoed through me, and they still do. I'll never forget it. It's burned in me. And I went home that day being really confused and really upset and really upset and feeling stupid, which is what shame does, and feeling like I knew nothing, which is what shame does. And then I started researching all the different Northwest Coast artists that were doing printmaking, and I saw how much form line has existed in printmaking. And so I really saw two different paths in that moment in my degree, and I told myself, like, well, you could this is clearly, in this situation, you've done nothing wrong, and this teacher is reluctant for you to be who you are because he knows absolutely nothing about who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And he is showing absolutely zero effort nor interest in understanding who you are. So you can either do what he wants, but that's not right. That doesn't feel right. Or you could, like, rebel and make form line anyway. And then maybe title the artwork at the end banning the potlatch
Oh
as a little
man.
FU, and reference the Indian Act and kind of hint at him that hinting at him that this behavior is no different than the intent of the Indian Act or the potlatch ban or the assimilation of our people. And I stood by that. Simultaneously as that class happened, I was also in a painting class. So by the end of that semester, that fall semester, I was angry. I was super angry. And poor soul, the painting teacher, she was actually really sweet. And my painting class became it became this safer space where I could process the frustration. I felt like my academic experience was falling apart. Something that happens in painting, and this is important to say because it ties into a lot of my practice and where my practice has gone. This was really the birth of oil
Mm.
painting being a part of my practice. And we're doing like a still life. At the time, I was like, why make me do another damn still life? I swear to God. And she said to me, like, well, do you want to like paint with acrylic or oil paint? And I'm like, well, I don't know how to do this stuff with either of these mediums. So would you like to recommend to me? And she was like, well, you should like try oil paint. So I was like, okay, I'll try it, whatever. And so I tried it and I ended up really liking it. I thought it was such a total different experience than acrylic or watercolor, and I actually really enjoyed it. We got to do an independent work, and she asked me if there's anything that I ever wanted to paint that I felt like I never had enough help to create. And I harkened back to a song that came out a long time ago, probably in like 2013 or so, and it was called Burn Your Village to the Ground. I remembered hearing that song and like always thinking in my head of a painting of a young woman that is like literally on fire and staring right at the camera. And that was my first, I would consider, successful piece in oil painting. I painted that painting was really large. It was like this self-portrait one. And it's really interesting thinking about that because that painting was so fiery. And this painting is also, it
Mhm.
holds that same fire. So it's kind of a full circle experience in university. But she was, that was basically like the first portrait I ever did. And it ended up being really successful. And it was like yeah, it was like 5 feet tall. And I remember I remember wanting it to be really big, and this also brings in the theme of scale because I paint really big often. And this was the first time I did a painting this size. And I wanted it to be so big that when the students and when the teacher walked in the room, it was like the first thing you looked at. But more importantly, that you couldn't not look at her.
Mm.
And so that theme of like when this story or this face is in this room and in this space, you will acknowledge them, whether you like it or not, whether you want to or not. Like you can't not acknowledge them. And that's when the scale aspect of my work was born because I loved the idea of creating work that whether you liked it or not, whether you enjoyed the colors or not, or the palette, that you can't not look at it. One more piece of context is that my form line, because this is still form line, but it's an oil painting. And when my form line was used in acrylic, it really wasn't accepted nor understood. And there was little to no effort being made by students, my peers, to interact with it and develop a narrative about the artwork. And I kept oil painting, and then I started thinking to myself, what if a form line was done in oil painting? What would it look like and how would it operate? Because oil painting is so different. And I just experimented. And then I noticed very quickly that my peers, but also my instructors, were just like, they were all over it. And that fascinated me. That the form line, the language of the form line was still there, but because oil was suddenly a part of how was a part of the painting and the way that the oil paint was the conveyor of that language of form line, all of a sudden it was accepted. And all of
Mm.
us, like all of a sudden it was more accepted. And all of a sudden people had more, and I mean people as in people in the institution, had more of an ability to have a discourse about the artwork. And I'd been practicing self-portraiture and realism, so I think that experience under my belt was also influencing the way that I could paint. I was experimenting with like painting atmosphere and energy and then connecting that to form line. And so I think self-portrait was a product of about 2 years of that experimentation and really coming to a point of understanding how I won't use the word like I would say like gaining enough experience to understand how I could really um create successful work with oil, like successful paintings with oil paint in terms of form line and this sort of atmosphere. So self-portrait was like it was a milestone.
Mhm.
in my life as an artist in my career. Self-portrait embodies, 5 years,
Mhm.
5 years of suffering in an institution that's not made for you, built for you, nor wants you to succeed. So self-portrait represents like everything that I just said the last 15 or 20 minutes. My grandma also got sick with cancer when I was in university.
Mhm.
And shortly after those classes, I had a science class early in the spring. We were having a midterm, and my grandma, right at the same time, her cancer came back with a
Mhm.
vengeance. And she went from being like totally independent to being bedridden within a week. And I had to miss school. I had to be at the hospital. My family was all here in the Yukon. I told my science teacher what happened, and I told him, like, if you make me do this midterm, I know I will fail because I've had no time. So you can either give me a new date or I will fail. If there's not even a point in me trying to do the test, I know I'll fail. And in that moment, he told me, when I was in university, my dog got cancer. And what I learned from that experience is that sometimes you just have to put your grief aside, like turn it off, do the work, do the tests, and feel your grief after. And
Whoa.
he made a very, very poor choice that day saying that. These are the kind of things that I experienced during school.
Mhm.
And my grandma would also pass away when I was still in university. And it's taken a long time for me to make peace with the fact that I could have been spending her last days with her here
Mhm.
in my homelands, in the lands of my ancestors, rather than being stuck at a sterile university where I was treated like trash. I could have been held with my community and been with her, but I was there. So that portrait, I'm getting fiery just looking at it, but that portrait embodies all of that. It embodies that anger, but also the relentless drive and fire that I have in me that I've built from really being like broken. Because I was
Mhm.
broken, especially when I painted self-portrait. It was like the final stand, the
Mhm.
final say of feeling so broken, and the very beginning spark of rebuilding and creating the life that I want to live and to be in, to really figure out how I want to be in these spaces, in these institutions. Self-portrait is literally me, but in form line. And if you look at the actual piece, this is a human and they have legs and hands. And if you look at the legs and the feet, one foot is like really, which would be to the right, if you're looking at the screen, the bottom right corner, that foot is like really flat and like grounded. Um, on the very bottom of the canvas and is like pushing up.
Mhm.
And then the other foot is like really curled in and is like their toes are, it's almost like their toes could begin to be being pushed into the ground, but the feet are pushing none of the less. And then the hands are doing this and they're right against this border. And so the left hand actually has a thumb about midway on the edge of the left side of the painting. Their thumb is like being completely bent like that.
Mhm.
So there's very obvious tension in the work where these gray blobs are functioning as walls in the work and they're pushing onto the figure, but the figure is pushing back at the same
Mhm.
time. The painting is all about that constant tension and that there always feels like that there is a tension in these institutional spaces. And we only have like one choice sometimes, and that is just to
Mhm.
push them back. And when I was still in university, it very much felt like I don't know if these tensions will ever end, but I can interrogate them. The energy behind the figure in the background is this fiery energy, and I think it's really appropriate that it's like it's existing throughout, aside from where the walls are, but you can see it like throughout coming through this being, which in this context is me.
Mhm. Thanks for sharing all that stuff. There's so many details I didn't even know, which is
I also wanted it to be like extremely striking. So not just scale, but also the high contrast of the colors, like that orange and like the embers in contrast with the turquoise. Like it's quite a like it's a very satisfying contrast that that lures you in. I really wanted it to demand your attention. And so those some of those embery colors that you see in there, those were there was similar ember colors of fire that were in the very first oil painting I did of that young girl.
now it's been 4 or 5 years since the birth of this painting. Have your thoughts about it changed?
I think the only thing that has changed is that I don't feel so raw.
Mm,
It's more of like I look at how this painting exists and why it exists. And I more so look at it and I reflect on just more so how far I've come
mhm,
and the healing that I've done. I think being a bit more accepting and like being okay with letting this painting go. Um, I think at the time I had a hard time thinking about that, but I feel more ready instead of like holding on to it for it to exist in spaces that it's meant to exist in. I know that it needs to exist in institutional spaces. It was made, and I understand, and maybe that's something I didn't understand at the time. Now I look at this painting and I don't think I had the words for it, but now I do. This painting was made to interrogate institutions, to interrogate colonial structures and institutions. And so I firmly believe that, this painting is meant to, go be in exhibitions. It's meant to be in galleries that, galleries always kind of there's some kind of like colonial compromise in my opinion in galleries. And there's always this certain like it's really hard to not have a colonial element to even exhibitions when they're in those spaces because
mhm,
it's observing, it's participating in the gaze in a certain way that doesn't exist in the context that I come from. I think this painting needs to always exist in spaces where there is some kind of compromise, and I think that there's usually some kind of compromise in institutions in learning, and that's
mhm,
really important to never forget and recognize. And these compromises, like, they're not always our faults as educators. Like I experienced those compromises when I was teaching in Juneau. Um, about 2 years ago when I was teaching at the university. There's compromises that were out of my control, but I had to abide by them. So it's interrogating those systems and it's interrogating these borders and these barriers that we feel like we are constantly running into in the institution. And it's showing those compromises and those barriers and it's throwing it right at people's face or right at an institution's face.
mhm,
And so I really think that for as long as this painting lives, it's meant to be a reminder of that and to tell those stories because it holds so much. It's a story. It's someone's entire it's a native student's entire undergrad in a painting, really. And I think that this this story that I told is one of the many that students of color have experienced in school. And these are the kind of stories that they should be in museums. So I mean, like my dream is that one day that this can be in a museum because I also have a lot of thoughts about museum politics. And I think one way to maybe remedy is too strong of a word, but one way to help progress if museum institutions are to still exist is to bring in contemporary work that is telling the story of colonialism rather than holding on to very old beings that should come home. Allow a living artist to tell you what happened and how what happened is impacting our lives now.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about Raven bringing light to the world. I guess what the story is that you're telling in the work, and then also a little bit of context to what your life was like at the time when you were making it.
This would have been going through the pandemic and going through a lot of difficult healing work, and also like just all of a sudden finishing my degree. Like I was a part of those students that we just finished, and it was supposed to be like kind of this celebration and this breath of fresh air. And COVID was the exact opposite. It was like the whole world shut down, and our graduation was an email. I think I felt really, I don't know, it felt like walking through fog for a really long time and really didn't know what I would do at the end of my degree. I had no idea what I was doing. And I enrolled in a language class that was 5 days a week, and I got to start learning my language, and it changed me. And I think it was the first step and the first stage of thinking about decolonizing and thinking about alternative worldviews and decolonial worldviews and seeing it, not seeing it, but feeling it and embodying it and doing it in practice rather than talking about it theoretically. I did like a fundamentals book, and then we're going on to the second one that was stories. We had just done the story, very iconic, very well-known story is how Raven brought light to the world. And I just learned how to say that story. Literally just learned how to say that story and think it. And then my mom called me saying, "Hey, there's these local filmmakers in the territory that are uh, looking for an artist to be a part of a project." They reached out to me. I told them the names of the artists in our dance group because my mom's the leader of our dance group.
Mm.
And she said, "So you might be getting a phone call." And then I got a phone call from them, and they're like, "Hey, we're this filmmaking company that have been tasked to create a video for Yukon tourism. And this is our vision. And we're thinking about having an artist. What do you think about that?" And I'm like, "This sounds really cool." And then they told me that they had been doing some research and found some like snowshoe or like snow artists in Europe. In terms of Indigenous communities in the Yukon, Raven is like pretty fundamental. Raven is an icon in our stories, in visual storytelling, in our art form. So they're thinking about Raven a lot, really referencing all these pieces of the story of how Raven brought light into the world. And I'm like, this is really crazy because I just learned how to say this story in my language. The entire process of the film was it was like the embodiment of collaboration. And then, them introducing me this idea of form line being in the snow was a collective decision. So they talked about snow, and then I told them my experience in form line. So through collaboration, we figured out a storyline of me voicing and telling the story of Raven bringing light into the world with my language. And while telling that story, I'm snowshoeing a raven in the snow that then gets revealed with the sun at the very end. The production of this was like a month. And so that little dot right in like the round shape inside the mouth, yeah, that's me. Just an idea for scale. And, oh yeah, and the words that you see in the bottom, that's the translation of the Tlingit. So when you're watching the video, you don't hear any English. It's all being communicated in Tlingit, which is like it's such a milestone in tourism in the Yukon. I've never seen a tourism commercial that's completely in a different language, in a traditional language of the region that it's representing. Some practical items about the project is that there was three trial runs before the fourth. And because it was being filmed and because it was for tourism and because we wanted the form line to look crisp and clear, I did not do that final raven in the snow all by myself. I had, the crew, and people, everybody, like I don't even know how many different people worked on. So this was the final one. So there was numerous people that worked on it. However, I will argue for how much walking I did throughout the film production. It was done on a lake. So, you know, not long after the wind would blow snow over the design, and then eventually this design would melt away into water and flow
Mm.
away with the Yukon River, and it's forever documented, but the design itself, and the steps that were made there, they're gone forever. And so it has this really poetic, indigenous, ephemeral element to it that I'm really proud of. Like that it's there and it's gone, and that it held so much substance, but the substance is gone now too.
Mm. Can you tell us a little bit about the image that you created?
Yeah. So the design itself is a raven's face, and then it has a wing underneath it.
Mm.
So, and then within that face, it has its beak, and then inside the beak there is the sun.
Oh,
So
okay.
what's cool about the design is that the actual circle you see s- um holding the raven, like the raven is sitting inside this circle. I made it kind of look like a really thin crescent to again kind of be a representation of like a crescent sun. Like, sorry, not a crescent sun, but like a crescent moon. It's literally a raven holding the sun. One of the first places we started filming was at my cabin in Tagish. And that first weekend of filming, that design just flew out. Like it just came out so easily. When we started filming, I'm very much like an embodying person and like
Mm.
being in it. So I was in it, and it came out very easily.
Do you remember anything about the what it was like to like learn the story in Tlingit and be the one speaking it for thousands of people?
First thing I'll say about learning the language, it's like there's no words for the experience, but you're opening a door in your mind where you start to like, you're building a relationship and starting to have access to a way of thinking that your ancestors had. And something that I experience as an artist often is that there's no words anymore for our art form in our language. It's gone. It died with colonialism. And so that is something that I have to live with. And when we're trying to figure out, how did my ancestors think about and talk about art? Language revitalization is one of the few ways of working through that. I even witnessed it with different students who, were older and may have been, even in the last years of residential school. There was times where I was watching them speak the language, and it was like they were fighting these walls that had been built
Mm.
so strongly, these walls of protection that they built within themselves because they would be punished whenever they spoke it. And so it was such a wild experience to witness someone having a very physical experience trying to fight back speaking it. And there was a lot of tension, and there was a lot of like pushing back, and it was wild. I was bearing witness to like intergenerational trauma being fought through, and it was coming up by speaking language that is ours, that belongs to us, that we're meant to speak. It has helped me feel more connected with my ancestors. It's helped me heal, and being a part of that cohort and being in that language journey led me to opportunities like this one that has helped heal me, and I think looking back has healed things that I didn't understand at the time, that has healed intergenerational pain that I didn't understand at the time. My whole life I've had times where it's just like there's something there that is yearning, and like only when I'm making art, and only when I'm dancing, and only when I'm speaking my language, and only when I'm connecting to the land does it feel like it's being held, and it's being worked through, and it's being healed. I look at this work and like just even in an aesthetic way, and the language part of it, like it's this is like a legacy work to me. Like I think that's any artist's dream, where they can make work that is so deeply from their spirit and heart, where they feel like, they're being a channel, really. Like, because sometimes I feel like I'm being a channel from my ancestors, and this project was one of them. That is healing first year Guna at Emily Carr that felt lost,
Mhm.
completely lost and didn't belong. I'm helping little, like knowing that I could help a little bit with like little Native kids in first grade, knowing that their stories are valid and deserve to be in the school system. That's like, bravo, bravo.
Amazing.